Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a deep, uh, really intense analysis of a high-stakes, real-time crisis.
Yeah.
And it's unfolding right now in the early weeks of 2026.
Right.
The nationwide uprising in Iran. And the source material we've been given for this deep dive, it's not like a standard intelligence brief.
Not at all. It's direct. It's almost accusatory, really.
Exactly. It presents this comprehensive, incredibly detailed argument for why the United States must act. And not just act, but why that action needs to be strategic, nuanced, and, immediate.
Right now.
Right now, as this situation hits just a terribly dangerous inflection point.
And what's so fascinating about the documentation here is that it doesn't just sit back and describe the geopolitical problem. It actively prescribes a solution.
Yes.
It demands a very specific strategic calculus from external powers, particularly the U.S. We're looking at a situation that's confirmed for Sunday, January 11, 2026.
So just a few days ago.
Just days ago. And the backdrop is this widespread, multi-provincial uprising against the central regime. And it's fueled by really a perfect storm of decades of repression and just complete economic devastation.
So for you listening to this, your mission in this deep dive is, well, it's crucial. We're aiming for a fast but a truly thorough understanding of all the dimensions here.
The political, the economic, the strategic.
All of it. The entire intervention debate. And we're going to stick very strictly to the arguments and the specific strategic plan that's laid out in the source context we have.
Yeah, we're not speculating here. This is an analysis of the document in front of us.
Exactly. We're staying within the four corners of this analysis.
And the central premise, the thing that drives this entire argument, it's stark and it's urgent. Iran, as the authors put it, is burning.
Burning. That's a powerful word.
It is. And it posits that former President Donald Trump, especially given his history of very specific rhetoric and promises of action regarding Iran.
Right, you talked about this a lot.
A lot. The source argues he must now fulfill that promise. But, and this is the key point, this is not a call for a blunt invasion like we saw in, say, 2003.
No.
It's a demanding argument for using a nuanced, a strategic form of what they call asymmetric pressure.
And that pressure is targeted.
Exclusively. Targeted against the instruments of the regime's fear and oppression, not the country, not the people.
Okay, so before we can even get to the proposed solution, we really need to understand the fire itself, right? The burning.
You have to.
So let's zoom in right now on that situation snapshot. Because this unrest, it didn't just materialize out of thin air as, purely political discontent. It's absolutely rooted in something much more fundamental.
Oh, absolutely. It's rooted in the staggering, almost unimaginable failure of the Islamic Republic's economic structure.
So to really get the intensity of these protests, you have to look at the money.
You have to look at the numbers behind the reel. These data points, they're the concrete unifying fuel for this fire. The sources highlight a collapse, that is. Well, it's hard to even picture.
Okay, so what's the headline figure?
The Iranian rial has lost over 90% of its total value since 2018.
90%. Let that sink in.
90.
That's not a recession. That's a structural implosion of an entire economy. How do we even visualize that?
Yeah.
What does that level of economic ruin actually feel like for an average Iranian family?
Okay, let's try to put it in perspective. Imagine a middle-class professional in Tehran. Let's say a civil engineer or maybe a small business owner.
Right, someone doing okay for themselves in 2018.
Exactly. Let's say in 2018, their income was enough to purchase a small, new family car, a Kia maybe, something reliable.
Okay.
By January 2026, so right now, that exact same income, it can barely cover the cost of 4 new tires for that car.
4 tires.
If they're lucky. That's the reality of a 90% devaluation. Inflation, as you can imagine, has just soared to astronomical levels.
So everything costs more and your money is worth nothing.
Precisely. And this devaluation means essential imported goods. And you have to think about what that includes. Things like specialized medicines for cancer or heart conditions, spare parts for industrial machinery that keeps factories open.
Even basic food.
Basic agricultural commodities.
Yeah.
They have become completely unobtainable for ordinary Iranians. They're priced out of survival itself.
So what we're seeing is that what started as, understandable, desperate protests over high prices.
Sure, people who just can't afford to feed their families or heat their homes in the winter.
It very quickly shifted. It went from an economic grievance to a profound political demand.
It had to. It escalated dramatically because that shared economic desperation, that feeling of being priced out of your own life, It created a nationwide consensus.
A unity of misery, in a way.
A unity of misery, that's a good way to put it. The economic crisis provided the concrete shared foundation for dissent that just transcended all the traditional divisions in Iran.
Like what? Regional? Class?
Yeah. Regional, social class, ethnic divisions, all of it. This shared systemic failure meant the movement just rapidly transformed from a protest against, the high cost of chicken to a full-scale, unyielding uprising against the regime itself.
So it's challenging the legitimacy of the entire theocratic system.
Entirely. It's no longer about a bad policy here or there. It's about power, who holds it, and how they've failed the entire nation.
Okay, so that brings us squarely to our first major section here. We need to detail the catastrophic human cost of this, which, in the argument we're dissecting, really grounds the profound moral urgency for action. If the economic collapse is the fuse, as you said, then the repression that the state deploys. That's the hammer. That's what drives this argument for external intervention.
And the human toll that's detailed in these sources is not just tragic. You have to understand, this is organized state violence on a massive scale as of early January 2026.
So what are the numbers?
We're looking at verified reports of over 500 protesters dead across the country. And the sources make a chilling, very specific point of confirming that that figure includes numerous children.
Wow.
On top of that, tens of thousands of citizens have been arrested, many of them just disappearing into the state's opaque prison system, and then countless more are wounded, often too afraid to even seek help at a hospital.
And the sources, they spend a lot of time detailing the sheer brutality of how the regime is responding.
They do.
This isn't just, heavy-handed policing or riot control.
Right. No. This is state-sanctioned murder, and it's aimed at one thing: terrorizing the populace back into submission.
So what are the tactics? What does that look like on the ground?
The reports are very specific. They detail security forces firing live ammunition indiscriminately into crowds of unarmed demonstrators.
Live rounds.
Live rounds. They're also utilizing pellet guns. Now, these are weapons designed to incapacitate, but at close range, they blind, they maim, they kill.
And the source says they're using these on whom?
Specifically on children and minors who join the demonstrations. This detail, the deliberate targeting of young people, is presented in the source as clear evidence of the regime's complete moral collapse. There's no coming back from that.
And beyond the immediate physical violence on the streets, the sources emphasize there's this whole other layer, an institutionalized layer of terror that's aimed at erasing what happened.
Yes, erasing the aftermath, controlling the memory of the crime.
So what specific acts of repression are detailed there?
Two elements really stand out as evidence of this institutionalized terror. First, security forces have been storming hospitals.
Storming hospitals.
Not to provide aid. They're going in to seize or intimidate the wounded. They will literally extract injured protesters from their hospital beds to prevent them from receiving proper medical care.
And what happens to them?
Often it results in their death or their disappearance into the prison system. The second element is just as horrifying. They are actively coercing families of the dead into silence, forcing them to sign documents, non-disclosures, preventing them from speaking out publicly about their lost loved ones. In some reported cases, they're even requiring families to pay for the bullets that killed their own relatives before they'll release the body.
I have no words for that.
It's an attempt to eliminate witnesses, to erase the truth, and to just completely break the will of the families and the community.
So this systematic attempt to hide the violence, it naturally leads us to the next part of this, which is the information war.
Of course.
If you can't hide the actions themselves, you try to hide the context. You try to cut the lines of communication between those who are resisting.
That's the logical next step for any authoritarian state that's facing this kind of widespread dissent. Tehran's comprehensive response, right around January 8th and 9th, was the implementation of a near-total, nationwide internet blackout.
A total blackout. And what's the objective there? It's pretty clear, isn't it?
It's threefold, really. First, you halt internal coordination among the protest groups. They can't talk to each other, can't plan. Second, you prevent independent reporting of the atrocities, like the hospital raids we just talked about. And third, you isolate the entire country from international scrutiny.
You're trying to pull a shroud of darkness over 80 million people.
That's exactly the goal. Kill the story by killing the signal.
But the silence, it's not complete. And this is where technology and, I guess, external support, even passive support, becomes a factor in the survival of the movement.
That's right. And this is a critical point in the source material. Despite that communication cutoff, the sources confirm that information is still leaking out.
Oh.
The documentation specifically mentions the role of Starlink satellite internet technology,
Ah.
and also the continued incredibly dangerous efforts of internal eyewitnesses and journalists on the ground. These are the primary means by which the truth is circumventing that blackout.
So what does that prove, according to the source?
It proves that the Iranian uprising is not only continuing, but that it's fiercely resilient. It's persisting despite the regime's best efforts to enforce this total informational darkness.
Okay, so let's connect the dots here, just to summarize the foundation of this crisis. The economic collapse is the engine.
Yes.
Specifically, the rial's devastating loss of 90% of its value since 2018. That concrete, shared economic pain is what unified the dissent across all 31 provinces.
It acts as a kind of universal solvent. It dissolves all other divisions.
And it turns these localized grievances into a true nationwide existential threat to the regime.
Yes. When the hardship is shared by everyone, from the small villages to the capital, from the traditional bazaar merchants to the university students, the focus just shifts. It moves away from individual or sectoral demands, and it moves towards the realization that the entire ruling structure is failing the entire nation.
And that unification is what makes this current movement fundamentally different.
And, the source argues, more dangerous to Khamenei than any of the previous waves of protest.
Okay, so now we have to introduce the crucial external factor, the piece that brings this whole strategic argument to a head.
Former President Donald Trump.
Right. His specific rhetoric, according to this source material, is a critical component of why this precise intervention argument is being mounted now in January 2026.
His statements have been exceptionally bold and very public. He has warned, and I'm quoting the source here, that the U.S. is locked and loaded and ready to strike if the killings of protesters continue.
That's not just, casual diplomatic signaling. That's a very direct threat.
It's incredibly direct, and that rhetoric, it does a few things. It raises the expectations of the protesters on the ground. It sends a clear warning to the international community. And critically, it puts the supreme leader and his instruments of repression, the IRGC and the Basij, on immediate, tangible notice.
And he's moved beyond just vague threats of, say, future sanctions. He's floated specific, identifiable targets for potential action.
He has. The source notes he specifically mentioned the idea of dismantling the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Basij militias.
And we need to be clear about who they are.
Absolutely essential. These are not the regular Iranian military, the Artesh. The IRGC and Basij are the ideological internal security apparatus. They are the regime's true instruments of fear and violence. Their job is to protect the revolution, not the nation's borders.
So by naming them specifically?
By naming them, he effectively drew a clear rhetorical line in the sand. And the argument now in this document is that because he drew that rhetorical line, he has created a kind of self-imposed strategic obligation to deliver a credible strategic follow-up, or else his entire threat is dismissed as empty bluster, and the regime feels it has a green light to continue the slaughter.
Okay, that analysis just propels us directly into our second section, the imperative for intervention. The source breaks this down into four main interwoven arguments for why external action is required immediately, and it moves beyond just documenting the humanitarian crisis.
Right. It moves into filling what they characterize as a dangerous moral and political vacuum. These arguments transition seamlessly from the moral horror we've just been discussing to the strategic necessities of geopolitics.
So let's start with the first, and maybe the most difficult, argument, the moral obligation. And this is built on that catastrophic death toll we detailed. What's the core assertion here regarding the killings?
The core assertion is just unequivocal. The sheer scale of the death over 500 citizens, including children, and the mass, indiscriminate arrests, these constitute clear, undeniable crimes against humanity.
It's not just bad governance.
No. The source argues this is state policy, a policy aimed at the systematic repression and elimination of dissent.
And this assertion isn't just, a philosophical one.
Yeah.
The source explicitly invokes a very specific and often very controversial international framework.
Yes, the responsibility to protect, or R2P doctrine.
We need to spend some time on this. For anyone listening, can you break down what exactly R2P is and why it's so potent in this context?
Of course. R2P is it's a set of principles that were adopted by all UN member states back in 2005. At its core, it asserts that state sovereignty is not a license for a government to kill its own people.
Sovereignty comes with responsibility.
Exactly. It's founded on 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is the primary responsibility of the state itself to protect its population. Pillar 2 is the international community's responsibility to help that state fulfill its duty.
And Pillar 3 is the controversial one.
That's the one. Pillar 3 is the international community's responsibility to intervene diplomatically, economically, or, as a last resort, militarily, if a state is manifestly failing to protect its population from 4 specific crimes.
Then those are
Genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity.
So by invoking R2P, the source is essentially making a legal and moral case that the Iranian regime's actions fall squarely under Pillar 3.
They're saying this is a textbook case. The analysis states that the R2P doctrine exists precisely for moments like this, where a sovereign state is actively and systematically murdering its own citizens at scale.
And the moral calculus that the source presents, it's incredibly stark. It's uncompromising.
It is. It says that failing to act in this situation risks complicity by inaction. And they use a powerful, really provocative phrase to drive this home.
Which is?
Stopping to watch is equal to consenting to the crime.
Wow. That's a demanding standard for international non-intervention. It suggests that just standing aside is itself a morally and legally relevant action?
It's akin to passive endorsement. It fundamentally redefines what neutrality means in the face of atrocity.
So there is no neutral ground here, according to this argument.
The argument is that when a state crosses the threshold of mass killing, when it commits crimes against humanity, external actors cannot truthfully claim neutrality. By refusing to interfere with the mechanism of violence, they are, in effect, taking the regime's side through passive endorsement of its brutality.
So it elevates the moral necessity to the level of an international obligation, regardless of the geopolitical complexities.
Exactly. The source acknowledges that R2P has often been criticized for its selective application in the past, but it insists that this is a textbook case where the principle must be upheld, or it has no meaning at all.
Okay, so moving from that moral imperative to the practical operation. The second argument is about how one would actually act.
Crippling the repression machine.
Targeting the very pillars of fear we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Who exactly are they identifying as the critical levers of violence that have to be degraded?
It's very specific. The IRGC and the Basij militias. These groups are explicitly named as the, and I'm quoting, backbone of Tehran's ability to murder its own citizens with impunity.
So they are the instrumentalities of fear.
They are. The organized, highly motivated units that translate the supreme leader's ideological will into physical attacks on the streets. And again, it's so important to differentiate them from the conventional Iranian army, the Artesh. The Artesh is substantial, but it's less ideologically driven. It's generally reserved for external defense, not cracking down on protesters. The source identifies the IRGC and Basij as the specific cancer that needs surgical removal.
So the proposed actions, they aren't about regime change in the traditional sense, like an invasion and occupation.
Not at all.
It's about surgically disabling specific groups. So what kind of disabling are they suggesting?
The plan calls for highly surgical strikes, advanced cyber operations, precision targeting, and all of it is aimed at significantly weakening these forces' command and control, their logistics, and their communication nodes.
And the strategic goal is articulated pretty clearly then.
Very clearly. It is not to overthrow the government directly. It is to give the protesters the necessary breathing room.
Breathing room.
The physical and operational space to advance their movement without being immediately crushed by overwhelming, organized state violence.
So you're essentially giving the protesters a fighting chance, but without placing a single Western boot on Iranian soil.
That's the concept. And the source uses a very specific historical parallel to justify this idea of dismantling security apparatuses without a full-scale occupation.
Which is?
Libya in 2011.
Ah, now that's a contentious example.
It is, but they draw a key distinction in how they use it. In 2011, NATO forces used air power to enforce a no-fly zone and to degrade Muammar Gaddafi's heavy armor and air defenses. The source argues that this effectively neutralized the regime's ability to wage war against its own population with tanks and jets.
And that tipped the military balance toward the opposition.
Exactly. The Iranian source suggests a similar model, surgical degradation of the IRGC and Basij capacity to eliminate dissent at scale.
But the Iranian context, it has to be much harder, isn't it? Gaddafi's forces were more conventional, centralized, using heavy armor. The IRGC and Basij are decentralized, they're embedded in urban areas, they rely on light vehicles, plainclothes agents.
Right, a totally different challenge.
So how does the source reconcile that complexity?
That's where the deep analysis comes in. The source implicitly acknowledges that difference. Targeting of the Basij doesn't mean bombing barracks. It means targeting intelligence centers, logistical nodes for riot control equipment, command bunkers,
And maybe even the commanders themselves.
and possibly the residences or the known movements of specific senior commanders who are issuing the kill orders. It's an intelligence-intensive operation that's focused on disruption, not necessarily mass destruction.
So the argument hinges on the belief that surgically degrading these specific command structures can effectively decapitate the repression capacity.
Yes, leading to localized defections and chaos within the ranks. And you do all of that without requiring the intervening power to become the occupying power.
Okay, that leads to the third imperative, which is purely about political and psychological signaling.
Specifically directed at Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and his inner circle.
Why is immediate, credible action necessary here? Why not just wait for sanctions to bite harder or for more diplomatic pressure?
The necessity, according to the source, stems from a deep understanding of authoritarian rule dynamics. They argue that autocracies, especially one as entrenched as the Islamic Republic, operate on a logic of zero-sum power.
Power is all that matters.
It's the only thing that matters. A decisive ultimatum, backed by credible action, a real demonstration of military resolve, is the only language guaranteed to force the supreme leader to actually reconsider his course of action. Khamenei has ignored years of crippling economic pressure. He will not ignore a physical peril to his regime's most trusted armed wings.
This sounds like what they reference as the Maduro lesson.
It is.
What exactly is that lesson, and how does it apply to the Iranian situation?
The Maduro lesson, which is drawn from the situation in Venezuela, is the cautionary tale of relying solely on political isolation and economic sanctions against a resilient autocrat.
And Maduro survived.
Maduro survived extensive international pressure. Remember, the U.S. and dozens of other countries recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader, but Maduro stayed in power, precisely because the external pressure never translated into a credible physical threat to his core security apparatus. His military and intelligence chiefs never felt that their loyalty to him would result in their own physical degradation or removal. They felt safe.
So the source is emphasizing that, and this is another quote, authoritarian leaders respect power, not pleas.
Exactly. The document asserts that dictators understand only strength, not mercy, not appeals to reason. If Trump's previous threats, his locked and loaded rhetoric, are not followed by strategic action now that this 500-death red line has been crossed, the threat is proven hollow.
And Khamenei will draw a conclusion from that.
A very dangerous one. He'll conclude the West is unwilling to accept the risk of escalation, and that will grant him the confidence to continue the crackdown until the movement is entirely crushed.
So the proposed action, then, is to couple the surgical kinetic pressure with a direct political challenge aimed right at the top.
Yes. The source explicitly proposes issuing a public, time-bound ultimatum, not just to stop the killing, but for Khamenei himself to step down, or face consequences that escalate beyond the mere degradation of his repressive tools.
And this combined pressure, it's designed to do more than just pressure the top, right?
It's designed to catalyze internal fractures. It forces everyone below the supreme leader, the commanders carrying out the arrests, the intelligence officers, the political elites. It forces them to question the wisdom and, more importantly, the long-term security of their continued loyalty. It makes them ask, is he worth it?
Which brings us to the fourth and final imperative. This one focuses on preserving the inherent momentum and the unique character of the Iranian movement itself.
Right.
What is the defining characteristic of this uprising that makes external support, in the source's view, a worthwhile bet rather than a risky imposition?
The source repeatedly characterizes the current uprising as organic, homegrown, and fiercely resilient. They also use the word unyielding.
And that's crucial.
It is absolutely crucial. It means the core energy, the political demand for change, and the legitimacy of the movement come entirely from within Iranian society. This is not a rebellion that was manufactured abroad. It is a genuine demand for political self-determination from the people themselves.
So given that, what specific role does the source define for external support in this context? Has to be very careful, doesn't it?
Very targeted, intelligent, and highly controlled. The argument is that if it's executed correctly, external pressure must amplify Iranian agency.
Amplify, not replace.
Never replace it, and never attempt to control its political outcome. The goal is to act as a catalyst and a shield. You clear the path of repression, but you let Iranians walk that path toward a new government on their own terms.
So the absolute worst outcome would be external action that inadvertently turns this popular, homegrown movement into what the regime claims it is, a foreign proxy.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the profound danger of hesitation. Every day that passes allows the regime to consolidate its power, to suppress the movement through sheer attrition.
Arresting one person here, another there.
Exactly. And at the same time, it allows them to successfully propagate their powerful, state-controlled counter-narrative that the protests are not genuine domestic dissent, that they are merely foreign-inspired and led by terrorists who are funded by the West.
So the key argument here is about timing. If you act now, you are supporting the truth, which is that the uprising is homegrown because it's still robust and visible.
But if you wait
until it's nearly crushed, then the regime can successfully rewrite history. They can claim the movement failed on its own, and any subsequent intervention would look exactly like what they said it was all along.
a desperate foreign imposition, precisely. The window for effective, supportive action that preserves the movement's organic legitimacy is closing rapidly. Once the regime successfully reestablishes control, the cost of any future intervention, both morally and strategically, just escalates exponentially. The source argues this is a fleeting, critical historical opportunity.
Of course, any discussion of military intervention in a country as strategically vital, as complex, and as large as Iran immediately triggers the most serious alarms around the world.
The biggest alarms, yeah.
Which makes Section 3 vital. The source doesn't ignore the immense counter-arguments and the critics' warnings. It addresses them head-on. And that seems to be an attempt to show a balanced perspective on the severe dangers involved, even while it's arguing for action.
The credibility of this entire proposal rests on its ability to confront those worst-case scenarios and provide a mechanism to contain them. If it can't do that, it's just reckless.
So let's start with those acknowledged risks. What are the specific red flags that critics would raise that the source has to contend with?
The source doesn't shy away from them at all. The risks are massive. Critics warn that any military intervention in Iran could provoke a full-scale, devastating regional war.
And what would that look like?
It could involve direct retaliation against U.S. assets in the Gulf bases, naval ships. It could mean missile strikes against Israel from Iran or its proxies, or an immediate activation of those proxy forces across the entire region, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen.
A multi-front war, essentially.
A nightmare scenario. And then there's the internal dynamic. Perhaps the most dangerous risk is that intervention could accidentally or even deliberately rally genuine nationalistic support for the current regime,
turning a domestic struggle for democracy into a national defense against a foreign Western aggressor.
You'd be handing Khamenei the one thing he doesn't have: popular national unity. These are not trivial objections. They are the reasons most major powers hesitate at this threshold.
And the source concedes these are.
They are conceded as real dangers. The source absolutely accepts the gravity of these concerns, but the argument pivots immediately. It asserts that while these risks are real, they are not insurmountable.
So they're manageable.
They're presented as manageable. The source argues that the danger of inaction, of watching a brutal regime crush a nascent democratic movement, is morally and strategically worse than the manageable risks of controlled intervention.
So the crucial strategic question then becomes, how do you contain these massive risks? How do you manage them?
That's the entire game. And their strategy for risk containment seems to rest very heavily on precision and clear demarcation.
So how is the proposed use of force constrained?
It emphasizes, and this is a key phrase, precision over reckless destruction. The constraint is absolute. The strikes must be targeted exclusively at IRGC and Basij command centers, their logistics, and military assets that are demonstrably linked to internal repression.
And nothing else.
And nothing else. This is a deliberate, highly constrained target list that would have to be derived from strict real-time intelligence parameters. And crucially, the source insists on avoiding all civilian infrastructure, energy facilities, and the assets of the regular military, the Artesh.
And that focus, that surgical approach aimed only at the tools of repression, that's the key mechanism for minimizing the risk of accidentally rallying that nationalistic support.
Yes.
You're targeting the regime's strongmen and enforcers, not the nation's survival mechanisms.
Exactly. The source argues that if the operation is clearly and publicly defined as disabling the murder machine, not bombing the nation, it drastically lowers the ability of the supreme leader to claim that the West is attacking Iran. Instead, the West is attacking the IRGC.
Okay, the second pillar of risk mitigation is coordination, international buy-in. Why is unilateral action not enough here?
Intervention on this scale cannot be unilateral if the goal is stability and managed risk. The necessity of coordination with regional and international allies is paramount. This provides multiple layers of necessary support.
And the key allies mentioned are?
Israel, the Gulf states, so think Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and NATO partners.
And what specific roles would those partners play? It's more than just political statements, I assume.
Oh, much more. They provide strategic depth, especially when it comes to logistics and staging areas. Israel, for example, offers critical, often unparalleled intelligence on IRGC and Basij movements.
Right.
The Gulf states can offer potential staging areas, overflight rights, and diplomatic leverage within the broader Arab world. And NATO partners provide vital diplomatic cover.
How so?
They allow the action to be framed as an international response to crimes against humanity under the R2P doctrine, rather than a purely American endeavor. This internationalization, it dilutes the blowback and the complexity for the U.S.
And the third mitigation tool is non-kinetic. It's about controlling the information space to prevent the regime from shaping the narrative of the intervention itself.
This is absolutely critical in modern conflict. The plan calls for robust cyber warfare and connectivity operations.
Like what specifically?
The source specifically mentions ensuring the consistent operation of Starlink and other satellite networks. The goal here is twofold. First, ensure the protesters remain informed and coordinated. But perhaps more importantly, shield them from the regime's inevitable propaganda that would claim the intervention is a foreign invasion to conquer Iran.
So if the regime can't control the narrative of the intervention, it loses a key tool for internal consolidation and that national rallying cry.
It loses its most powerful nonviolent weapon.
Now, the source has to recognize that the shadow of past failures looms large over any discussion of intervention in the Middle East.
Immense. You can't even say the word intervention without people thinking of Iraq and Libya.
Exactly. And they're often cited by critics as definitive proof that these interventions always backfire.
And the source presents them not as reasons to avoid action, but as essential cautionary tales that you have to study meticulously. Iraq in 2003 and Libya in 2011 highlight the severe risk of political overreach and a complete lack of post-conflict planning.
So the critique that's leveled against these past interventions is pretty precise then.
It is. The source argues they successfully removed highly centralized leaders, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, but they failed dramatically on the follow-through.
And what were the specific consequences of that missing follow-through that the source highlights?
In Iraq, the mistakes were catastrophic. The decision to remove the entire state apparatus through de-Baathification and to dissolve the National Army, that created a massive instant power vacuum.
Which was filled by
sectarian violence and foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later became ISIS. In Libya, NATO successfully degraded Gaddafi's capacity to kill his own people, but then they just walked away.
Which led to
years of communal violence, civil war, instability, and a massive flow of weapons and militants across all of North Africa. In both cases, the core failure was removing the leader without adequately preparing or empowering a local civil society structure to fill the resulting void.
So how does the source argue that the Iranian distinction, this specific case, avoids repeating these exact failures?
The key distinction, they argue, is the domestic strength and depth of the existing opposition. In Iran, the uprising is already a powerful existing force.
It's not being created from the outside.
It is organic, it is widespread, and it includes sophisticated political elements, labor leaders, intellectuals, people who have been working underground for decades. The strategic intervention proposed here is specifically designed to empower this existing force.
To serve as a shield against the IRGC hammer.
A shield, not a replacement. It's designed to enable an existing democratic impulse, not to try and impose one onto an empty political slate, which is what happened in Iraq.
This brings us back to the urgency factor, that ticking clock that runs through the entire source document. Time, according to the authors, is the regime's greatest ally if the West hesitates.
The opportunity is vanishing rapidly. The moment the IRGC and Basij successfully break the back of these mass protests, even if dissent continues in small pockets, the strategic window slams shut. Because every day without an external challenge allows the regime to kill more citizens, to consolidate their position, to suppress the movement incrementally through arrests and disappearances, and to establish a new equilibrium of fear.
And every moment of hesitation It strengthens Supreme Leader Khamenei's ability to control the narrative.
Which is crucial for maintaining internal control and preventing defections within his own ranks.
And his propaganda machine, it relies on a few key messages, right?
3 key messages, all of which are reinforced by external inaction. First, that the West is weak, it's divided, and it's ultimately afraid to act on its threats.
So a paper tiger.
A paper tiger. Second, that the protests are merely foreign-inspired and not a true reflection of the Iranian people's will. And third, and this is the most crucial message for internal actors, that dissent will inevitably fail, that the regime's power is total, unchallenged, and will crush any resistance without consequence.
Therefore, the final choice, as it's framed by the source, it's not simply between acting or not acting.
No, it's a choice between seizing a historical opportunity to enable change or accepting a historical failure that results in the deaths of hundreds more citizens and the suppression of liberty for another generation.
That is the strategic conclusion they draw. The source insists that Trump has both the moral mandate, because of the killings, and the strategic mandate, because of his previous rhetoric.
And the alternative is to just watch. To watch a genuine democratic movement be crushed, resulting in a predictable and, they argue, avoidable humanitarian and strategic failure.
Okay, this is where we need to dedicate the majority of our time and analysis.
This is the core of it.
We're focusing now on the highly detailed non-invasion strategy that's designed, in their words, to save lives rather than multiply them. We have to dive deep into the operational and strategic logic behind what the source calls the 6 pillars of asymmetric pressure. This is the heart of the argument.
It is. And this section, it rejects the entire concept of blunt force regime change that we've seen in the past. It favors, instead, controlled asymmetric pressure. This entire strategic architecture is aimed at disabling the state's ability to kill at scale without provoking a regional conflagration.
It's a very high-wire act.
An incredibly high-wire act. And again, it has to be stressed. The goal is not a military invasion or a long-term occupation. It is a rapid, targeted, enabling action.
Okay, let's take them one by one. Pillar 1. Redefine the mission. Protect civilians, not change the regime. This first pillar is all about clarity of intent. It's about narrative control, which the source identifies as the most strategically vital first step. Why is the public framing of the mission so crucial before any kinetic action is even taken?
Because it dictates everything that follows. It dictates international acceptance, and it dictates the regime's immediate propaganda response. If the U.S. frames this mission as regime change, it immediately validates commonized claims of foreign aggression.
It proves him right, in the eyes of some.
It proves him right. It triggers hardline nationalist sentiment not just in Iran, but across the Middle East, and it alienates potential allies who are wary of another American-led war. But if you frame it narrowly and defensively, it can achieve the strategic objectives while adhering to international legal norms.
So the intervention has to be described as a humanitarian action, not a political one.
Exactly.
And the source provides 3 specific, narrow objectives that achieve this framing. What are they?
These objectives are the strategic backbone. Objective 1. To halt mass killings of civilians. This is purely defensive and humanitarian. It's about stopping a crime in progress.
Okay.
Objective 2. To degrade the state's capacity for internal repression. This means you are specifically targeting the logistics and command of the IRGC and the Basij, not the whole government.
And the third?
Objective 3. To create space for Iranians to decide their own political future.
And that focus on creating space for Iranians is critical, isn't it?
It's everything.
It implies that the U.S. is just clearing the repression out of the path. It's not walking the path for them or, pre-selecting the next government.
That is the immense strategic value of this highly focused framing. It drastically reduces the regime's ability to rally that nationalist sentiment we talked about. It reassures skeptical, educated Iranians who deeply fear foreign domination just as much as they hate the current regime.
And what about the international arena?
Most importantly there, it aligns the action with international norms, specifically that R2P doctrine we discussed. By limiting the scope of the mission, you limit the diplomatic fallout.
And the source uses a very specific historical model to illustrate this approach, contrasting it sharply with the failures of the early 2000s.
Yes, they explicitly compare this approach to Kosovo in 1999.
Okay, Kosovo. Let's talk about that.
Kosovo was a NATO intervention, and it was done without explicit UN Security Council authorization, which was controversial. But it was justified as a campaign of coercive pressure applied with a very defined humanitarian purpose.
Which was stopping Slobodan Milosevic's systematic ethnic cleansing of Albania.
Exactly, stopping the killing. And this approach is contrasted sharply with Iraq in 2003, which was perceived globally as a full-scale invasion with undefined, long-term, non-humanitarian goals.
So the source is arguing that Kosovo provides the template for a limited humanitarian coercion that results in political change that's then driven by local actors.
That's the model they're putting forward.
But the comparison to Kosovo is politically volatile. Critics would immediately point out that the intervention still involved extensive bonding of a sovereign country and had massive geopolitical consequences with Russia and China. How does this source anticipate and counter that criticism?
They counter it by staying laser-focused on the purpose. In Kosovo, the goal was to stop the killing and ensure the safe return of refugees, thereby preserving life and liberty. The strategic similarity to the Iran case is that focus on degrading a state's ability to commit atrocities against its own people. The source acknowledges the kinetic action, the bombing, but it insists that the intent, the publicly stated language of the mission, must be narrowly humanitarian to succeed strategically.
Okay, that brings us to Pillar 2, which gets into the truly surgical nature of the targeting. Decapitate repression, not the state. This requires a very advanced understanding of the structural weaknesses of the Iranian regime.
It does. The analysis insists that the Islamic Republic survives not because the Iranian state as a whole is powerful or popular, but because of a specific subset of institutions that carry out the mass violence.
So you don't target the whole government.
You don't target the economic ministries or the central bank or the regular army. They are not the immediate targets because they are not the source of the bloodshed on the streets. You have to target the source of the brutality.
And once again, those specific high-priority targets are?
They are ruthlessly specific. The leadership structures of the IRGC and the Basij, along with their associated internal security, intelligence, logistics, and command ecosystems.
So what does that mean in practice? Communication centers?
Communication centers, data hubs, command bunkers, things that are tied directly to internal repression. The action must be strictly institution-specific. It cannot be countrywide or population-focused.
Why is that crucial distinction between targeting institution-specific assets and broad countrywide assets so important? I mean, beyond the obvious reason of minimizing civilian harm.
It achieves multiple complex strategic goals at the same time. First, yes, it minimizes civilian harm and avoids any sense of collective punishment. But second, and this is the most strategically brilliant part of it, it sends an unmistakable signal to the broader Iranian bureaucracy.
The people just doing their jobs.
The civil servants, the regular military, the Artesh, the national police, all the people who might be sitting on the fence or are even quietly sympathetic to the protests.
And the signal is what?
The signal is that defection is survivable. If you only target the IRGC, you give the regular state apparatus a powerful incentive to just stand down, or even to subtly align with the protesters. You're not a target.
So it's about breaking loyalty, but not universally. You break it selectively.
Yeah.
And you enable the fence-sitters to move without fearing that they'll be destroyed along with the hardliners.
Exactly. The core psychological insight here, according to the source, is that authoritarian systems collapse when fear breaks unevenly, not when the system is attacked universally.
What do you mean by that, fear breaks unevenly?
If you attack the whole country, everyone rallies around the flag, even the neutral elements, even those who hate the regime. It becomes about national survival. But if you only target the hardline ideological elements who are known for doing the killing, you create a political and a military schism. You create a crack in the regime that allows the internal resistance to gain critical mass.
Okay, that moves us to Pillar 3. Use escalation ladders, not shock and awe. This seems designed to make the action defensible and, maybe more importantly, containable.
It is entirely about controlling the narrative of conflict initiation and escalation. The source completely rejects the idea of a dramatic, massive first strike, a shock and awe campaign that would just invite an immediate, overwhelming retaliation from Iran.
So instead of that?
Instead, it advocates for a graduated escalation ladder. Every single step you take up that ladder is conditional on the regime's specific, verified behavior on the ground. This introduces a measure of control and predictability, and it allows both sides time to process the action and the threat.
And that, critically, mitigates the risk of an accidental full-scale regional war.
That's the hope.
So what does that ladder actually look like in practice? Can you walk us up the rungs, step by verifiable step?
Okay, it begins not with bombs, but with words. Explicit warnings tied directly to verified protester deaths.
So an example would be?
A public declaration. If the number of confirmed civilian deaths crosses 550 in the next 24 hours, the following specific action will be taken against IRGC Command Node X. Very clear, very specific.
And if those warnings are ignored?
You move to the next realm. Time-bound ultimatums focus specifically on ending the use of live fire and the cessation of those hospital raids. This gives the regime a chance to stop the killing without having to admit total defeat. It gives them an off-ramp.
And only if the killing continues, you move to the third step.
Yes. Only then. The third step is the progressive degradation of repression capacity. This is where the surgical strikes would begin. Aimed at communications, logistics, command nodes, but only in direct response to continued, documented atrocities. The strikes would then increase in scope and severity as long as the regime continues its internal war.
So the regime effectively chooses its own level of pain.
They do. Their choice is based on whether they're willing to stop killing their own people.
And the strategic logic there is?
The source puts it this way. Give the regime off-ramps, then punish it for refusing them. This approach is fundamental because it preserves deterrence. The threat is demonstrably real while critically keeping diplomatic exits and de-escalation paths open. It allows the supreme leader, theoretically, to claim he paused the crackdown in the face of international aggression rather than being overthrown, which might reduce his incentive to escalate regionally out of pure desperation.
Okay, Pillar 4. This one recognizes that modern conflict is waged as much in the cyber and information domain as it is in the physical one. Dominate the information and connectivity space.
This is a lesson learned from every single uprising of the last decade, from the Arab Spring onwards. The lifeblood of modern opposition movements is, and I'm quoting, coordination, visibility, and narrative control.
And the Iranian regime's internet blackout proves they understand this completely.
Fully. If they cut communication, they plunge the resistance into darkness, and that allows them to kill and arrest, unseen, undocumented.
Therefore, the intervention has to treat information access not as some kind of tool of war, but as a priority for human rights and safety.
It has to be treated as a humanitarian necessity, like food or medicine, not a luxury item for elites. And the strategic priorities in the cyber domain, according to the source, include the sustained maintenance of independent connectivity for civilians.
Starlink again.
Starlink plays a key, publicly visible role here. It also includes countering regime disinformation in real time with verified facts and, crucially, preserving digital evidence of abuses for future accountability.
Preserving evidence is a fascinating detail. It's not just about the here and now. It ties the kinetic action directly to the legal action we're going to discuss in the next pillar.
It provides the long-term strategic depth.
Yeah.
Authoritarian violence thrives in darkness. By guaranteeing transparency and constant access to information, the source calls light a non-kinetic weapon.
A non-kinetic weapon.
The ability to immediately broadcast the actions of the IRGC on the streets, who fired, who died, where the bodies went. It exposes the regime's crimes in real time, it undermines their credibility, and it strengthens the international legal case against them all at the same time.
But practically, how do you sustain connectivity against a sophisticated regime that's actively trying to jam signals or even shoot down satellite receivers?
The source implies a very high level of technical protection and redundancy would be required. This means actively neutralizing the regime's jamming capacity, perhaps through cyber countermeasures or even precision kinetic strikes against known jamming stations. It means ensuring the physical delivery and security of Starlink receivers on the ground, and using advanced data encryption to keep those communication lines open and secure. The battle for connectivity is framed as a continuous, high-tech operation that's just as vital as protecting civilian lives kinetically.
Okay, Pillar 5. This connects the military pressure with long-term, inescapable consequence. Internationalize accountability, not just pressure. Why is pressure alone, without a clear legal consequence for the perpetrators, insufficient?
Because military pressure, in the short term, only addresses the symptom of the violence, the ongoing killing. If there's no legal consequence for the individuals who are committing the crimes, the regime, or the remnants of it will simply repeat its actions later on once the external pressure subsides.
But this is about changing the calculus for the individual actors carrying out the repression.
Exactly, from the street commander in the Basij all the way up to the supreme leader's intelligence chief.
What specific simultaneous actions should the U.S. and its allies pursue to establish this accountability?
The source says 3 things must be launched concurrently with any kinetic pressure. First, promoting international investigations into the mass killings, establishing a clear chain of command responsibility. who gave the orders.
No.
Second, publicly naming the officials responsible for the internal repression. You use sanctions mechanisms like the Magnitsky Act to target these specific individuals and their families.
You make it personal.
You make it very personal. And third, you signal future legal exposure. That means asset seizures, permanent international travel restrictions, the threat of a future trial at The Hague.
So you start hitting them in the pocketbook, limiting their freedom of movement and threatening their future security while the conflict is still ongoing.
This is critical for driving those internal regime fractures we talked about and accelerating the defection mechanism. History shows us that elites begin to defect not only when the center of power weakens, but specifically when impunity ends.
When they realize they might be held personally liable.
When they believe they can be held personally and legally liable for mass murder, their loyalty to Khamenei wavers, and they start looking for an exit strategy for themselves and their families.
And the message then is delivered directly to the IRGC foot soldiers and the commanders who are physically carrying out the orders on the street.
It has to be unambiguous. And it has to be broadcast widely using the connectivity network from Pillar 4. And the message is simple. Orders you follow today may prosecute you tomorrow. This weaponizes the fear of international justice against the regime's own instruments of violence, making loyalty to the supreme leader a catastrophic personal risk. This is the moral dimension translated directly into strategic effect.
Okay, that brings us to the final pillar, Pillar 6. And this addresses the long-term chaos factor, which was the undoing of the interventions in Iraq and Libya. Pair pressure with a political horizon.
This is maybe the most important part for preventing what comes after.
Coercion without a clear political vision for the future just breeds chaos and unnecessary regional fear.
That's right. If external action simply creates a power vacuum, every single actor, from regional rivals like Saudi Arabia to internal technocrats inside Iran, they will all panic. And that panic leads to internal anarchy or a desperate regional conflict to fill the void. The strategy has to offer a clear, reassuring political horizon to all the stakeholders.
Because if people don't know what comes next, they may just support the devil they know, the current regime, out of sheer fear of the unknown anarchy.
It's a powerful human instinct.
So what specific binding commitments must the U.S. make clear to reassure all of these internal and external stakeholders?
The commitments have to be defensive, supportive of Iranian sovereignty, and highly explicit. The source says the U.S. must clarify 3 points. First, that it supports Iranian sovereignty and territorial integrity. No carving up the country.
That's a huge fear.
A massive one. Second, that it does not seek territorial control or a permanent military presence in Iran. This is a direct rebuttal to the invasion fear. We are not staying.
And third?
And third, and this is crucial, that it will recognize and work with any legitimate Iranian-led transitional authority that emerges from this democratic impulse. We don't pick the winner. They do.
This reassurance, it's directed at a massive, complex audience.
Right.
Who are the key groups the U.S. is trying to bring off the fence with this clear political horizon?
Primarily 4 critical groups. The protesters themselves, to assure them that their struggle won't be co-opted or turned into an American satellite state.
Okay.
The technocrats and the civil servants who keep the lights on and the water running, they must be convinced not to flee the country if the regime falls, because you need them to rebuild.
The regional rivals.
Yes, regional rivals like Saudi Arabia and Israel. They have to be assured that this intervention will lead to a stable, non-aggressive government, not regional chaos on their borders. And finally, the soldiers and officials currently sitting on the fence. This gives them a safe landing zone should they choose to defect.
And this really defines the ultimate success condition for this entire intervention model, doesn't it? Stability driven by local forces.
Yes. Revolutions succeed not just when regimes fall, but when a viable, non-anarchic future becomes immediately imaginable. The external action must ensure that the path to that imaginable future remains open, protected from the IRGC, and viable for the Iranian people to complete their struggle for self-determination. The political horizon, it turns a military action into a strategic enabler.
We have spent a lot of time here unpacking one of the most demanding and detailed strategic arguments for intervention in a generation.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. We started with the economic devastation that fueled this widespread revolt. We documented the catastrophic human toll of the repression. We established the moral and strategic imperatives for immediate action based on the source's analysis.
We grappled with the severe risks of escalation.
And we analyzed in deep detail this six-pillar plan for controlled asymmetric pressure.
The strategic bottom line, as it's presented in the source, is unwavering. This moment, they argue, demands resolve with restraint, not recklessness.
And the source argues that Iran's rulers, they crossed a line.
A fundamental, undeniable threshold. The killing of over 500 of their own citizens, including children. That scale of violence, they argue, fundamentally changes the moral and the strategic calculus. It makes inaction indefensible.
Former President Trump has already drawn the rhetorical line by threatening direct intervention. The source material insists the next necessary step is to draw a credible strategic one that acts as both a shield and a deterrent.
A strategic line that must be firm enough to stop the killing immediately, measured enough to avoid a regional catastrophe, and principled enough to allow Iranians to complete their struggle for freedom without foreign domination. It is, perhaps, the highest stakes, most detailed non-invasion strategy put forward for an adversary of this magnitude.
History rarely offers clean, straightforward options, does it? But the source insists that in moments of mass atrocity, it often offers necessary ones.
Yeah, and this leads us to the final provocative thought for you, the learner, as you digest the complexity of this entire proposal. The source fundamentally argues that when a regime commits mass killings on this scale, neutrality is not a default position.
It becomes a deliberate choice.
It becomes a decision to allow the violence to continue. And if neutrality is a choice in the face of tyranny, you have to ask yourself, what moral or strategic weight does inaction carry? And what are the long-term costs of simply standing aside?
What stands out to you as the most critical pillar among the six we just discussed for preventing catastrophe, while at the same time supporting fundamental Iranian-led change? That's the question we'll leave you with as you weigh the arguments for strategic intervention in this escalating crisis.